Chapter 1. Harry on the Run. When Dobby came to see him the summer after his first year, Harry had been stuck with a terrible choice. Return to Hogwarts or run away. He had desperately wanted to return to school, but he spent nights awake worrying, less about himself and more about the only people he ever really cared about. If his life was in danger, he knew it meant that it would put other people at risk, people like Ron and Hermione. He knew that he would never be able to live with himself if anything happened to them because of him. When the Dursleys left on a weekend away to visit Aunt Marge, Harry took his moment to escape for good. He was able to break down the locks and retrieve his wand and invisibility cloak from the cupboard. He was packing light, so he'd leave all his other school supplies there. He grabbed one of Dudley's old backpacks and filled it with essentials, and then stole 200 quid from Aunt Petunia's emergency money that she kept in a coffee can under the kitchen sink. Harry knew this was what was best for everyone. So he said his private goodbyes to 4 Privet Drive and walked out the front door, making his way to the bus stop just as the sun was beginning to creep over the horizon. By his calculations, it would take 3 bus transfers and a few hours to make his way to Croydon. He had decided it would be best to stay on the outskirts of London for the time being, afraid someone might recognize him if he was found creeping around in the main part of the city. He knew he had to be smart about things and avoid using magic at all costs. If he was going to stay under the radar, he had to be careful. He knew his cloak would help him move around easily, and he just hoped that his years of fending for himself would help him survive. If anything, it was better than being at the Dursleys, and certainly better than getting himself and his friends killed back at Hogwarts. It was nearly the start of term before Dumbledore, or anyone else in the wizarding community, realized that Harry Potter had gone missing. His relatives had returned to find him gone, and counted it as a blessing, going on about their normal lives, considering themselves quite fortunate that their freak of a nephew had taken it upon himself to remove himself from their care. It was the Weasleys who raised the alarm. After multiple letters went unanswered, they finally took a trip to Surrey and found the Dursley residence completely devoid of Harry Potter. They immediately reached out to Dumbledore to formulate a plan to track him down and bring him back safely. Dumbledore had convened a group of his most trusted colleagues. He called on Minerva McGonagall, Severus Snape, Arthur and Molly Weasley, and Alistair Moody. They knew that they could not let news of Harry's disappearance leak to the wizarding world at large, and that they must find him as quickly as possible in order to keep him safe and return him to Hogwarts. At first it was days, then weeks, and then months without any signs. They told the other students that Harry was recovering from a particularly bad case of dragonpox, and that he would return to school when he was better. After a few weeks, the questions died down, and everyone seemed to go on with life without asking too many more questions. Behind the scenes, however, everyone in the know was frantic. Dumbledore had regularly called on Snape to investigate any potential tips or ideas as to where they might find the boy, but they had continually come up empty. Harry had not used his magic once since walking out the door of Privet Drive, so tracking him down was proving very difficult. It was the end of April, and it had been almost 10 months since Harry ran away. He had started his adventures in Croydon, but soon realized it didn't take long before his face became known to the locals, and social services started asking questions. He moved on every few months, staying in Muggle areas and trying not to draw too much attention to himself. He went from Croydon to Bristol, then on to Bath, and finally to Brighton, where he found there was just enough of a transient community to pass unnoticed with all of the holiday and visitors. Harry had learned as a younger person, one who looked quite innocent, that he could get by fairly easily on handouts. He knew the bakeries and shops who put their expired food out, carefully wrapped in plastic just outside of their back door. There were also several kebab shops and other restaurants that would give him a free meal if he walked in and asked for it, usually at the end of the day. When he needed to, he had his cloak, and he'd become quite adept at swiping whatever he needed if he didn't have a choice. He tried to avoid stealing if he could, but he knew if he had to, that he would get away with it. He was lonely often, and while he tried not to let anyone get to know too much about him, he'd occasionally hang out with some of the older kids who were sleeping rough. Most of them were in their mid to late teens, and the group was constantly changing as kids went back home, got picked up by police or social services, or as they moved in and out of hostels and other crash pads with their friends. He learned a lot from these other kids, following them around to know the best spots to hide out during the day when it was too hot or too cold, where to get food, and where to avoid getting harassed by the police. They taught him quite a bit about survival, but it also helped him feel less alone, to know there were other kids who had come from quite horrible circumstances, many of which made him feel like life at the Dursleys was actually quite tame. Still, none of them had a crazed evil wizard trying to murder them, so he tried not to play the whose life is worse game in his mind. The weather was just starting to be somewhat decent in Brighton, and the crowds were picking up, which meant he was able to slink around and survive out in the open with a lot more ease. It had been a pretty uneventful day, and Harry was pleased he'd waited long enough on a Tuesday night that the kind lady at one of the kebab shops had given him a bag full of chips and a chicken shawarma, along with a wish for a pleasant evening. He walked out of the shop and headed back toward his little hideaway, not realizing at first that he was being followed. Harry rounded the corner, heading into a cozy courtyard where he'd stashed his backpack and usually slept the night in a small garden surrounded by mostly pensioners in a half-empty apartment complex. It was always quiet there and safe, and with his cloak draped over him at night, no one ever bothered him or knew he was there. But what Harry didn't realize is that he was mindlessly enjoying his hot chips, was that two teenage boys had followed him out of the shop. They were not part of the crew of usual runaways and other teens that he knew that slept rough in Brighton, but they were local lads who would sometimes drink a bit too much and cause trouble when they were bored. "Oi, give us the chips then," one of the boys shouted at Harry, grabbing his arm from behind. Harry spun around and tried to keep his face neutral. His heart was racing, but he knew that he had to keep his cool. He didn't want them to see the fear in his eyes, but neither did he want to act too tough and antagonize them. They were much bigger, and there were two of them. He handed over his bag of food. "Here, take it," he said, trying to sound as unfazed as possible. The bigger of the two boys laughed and pushed Harry against the brick wall. "What else you got there?" And they started to dig around in his pockets, looking for cash, a card, or anything else they might be able to take. Harry didn't have anything on him. His wand and his cloak were hidden in the bushes near the hideaway, and he only had a few coins on him, which he would gladly give. But it seemed obvious to Harry that these boys didn't really want his food or the few quid he had. They were just looking for trouble and were amusing themselves with him in the same way an alley cat might play with a mouse they'd pounced on. "Where's your mummy, little boy?" laughed the other boy, swigging from a large can of beer. "Shouldn't be out here all by yourself at night like this. Something bad could happen to you." Both boys laughed, and the bigger boy pushed Harry again against the wall, grabbing his shirt and ripping the collar, causing both boys to crack up even harder. The second boy grabbed Harry's pants and reached into his pockets to find the few pound coins and 60 pence in change. He pocketed the 1 pound coins and threw the rest on the street. Harry tried to remain calm, but he knew that he was in no position. His internal alarm bells were ringing, and his anxiety was skyrocketing. These boys were delinquents, a little drunk, and fully capable of harming him in more ways than one. He could feel his magic starting to well up inside of him. When the bigger boy put out one hand and grabbed around his neck, and then reached for the waistband of his trousers with the other. Something inside Harry exploded. He knew he had to get away from them, and only his magic could save him. So he closed his eyes and let it explode out of him. The boys were blown back away from him, beer cans flying, and the two of them landing on the street, unconscious, with a loud thud. Harry looked around quickly and realized they were still alone in the alley, and he made a run for it. He ran quickly to his stash, grabbing his backpack, his wand, and his cloak, and the few items of clothing he had, and he kept running. He ran for a while through the dark streets, making his way toward the beach, but making sure to run in a zigzag pattern so no one could follow him. It wasn't the height of tourist season yet, but there were still people along the boardwalk. He made his way in that direction, hoping he'd be safer in the one part of town where there were still people walking around. He slowed his walk to blend in. He knew he had to get out of Brighton right away, but it was close to midnight and there was no way out tonight. He'd have to wait until morning and take buses and trains and find his way somewhere else. He knew it wouldn't be long before they tracked his magic, but he hoped that he would still have enough for a good head start. He just needed to find somewhere he could rest and plan for a few hours. He walked down the deserted part of the beach off the boardwalk and found his way to an abandoned pier. He figured he could see a long way down the beach in both directions, and he could just camp underneath it until daybreak when he'd find his way out. He set his bag down and leaned up against one of the columns, catching his breath and trying to push the events of the evening out of his mind. He took a deep breath and willed himself to relax and think clearly. He was exhausted, scared, lonely. He felt like indulging himself in all of his feelings of misery and self-pity, but he also knew he didn't have the energy for it. He just needed to rest a little bit, and then he could make a plan. He'd get out of there tomorrow, and he'd start all over again. He'd done it before. He could do it again. Harry allowed himself to close his eyes and think about happier times. He thought about Hogwarts and playing Quidditch and chatting away happily with Ron in the Great Hall. He hadn't meant to fall asleep, but his mind drifted off, desperate for the comfort of his happiest memories.